The wind didn't just blow through the valley of Blackwood pines. It breathed. It was a wet, rattling sound, like air moving through a throat filled with stones. For Elias Thorne, a 24-year-old investigative journalist with a penchant for dead ends, Blackwood was supposed to be his big break. He sat in his rusted sedan, the engine clicking as it cooled, staring at the iron gates of the Blackwood Manor. The house sat atop a jagged hill, looking less like a building and more like a jagged tooth erupting from the earth. He checked his recorder, his fingers trembling slightly. Entry 1, he whispered. I'm at the gates. The locals in the village 3 miles back wouldn't even say the name of this place. They just crossed themselves and looked at my tires, like they expected them to melt. He stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots with a sound that seemed too loud in the oppressive silence. The air was unnaturally cold for mid-July, carrying the scent of wet copper and old, undisturbed dust. Elias wasn't there by accident. 3 weeks ago, he had received a heavy, cream-colored envelope with no return address. Inside was a single gold-rimmed card that read, "The truth of the 1924 disappearances is buried in the cellar. Come and dig." As a student of history and a skeptic by nature, Elias knew the legend. In 1924, the Sterling family, mother, father, and 4 children, had sat down for Sunday dinner. When the maid returned from the kitchen with the roast, the dining room was empty. The food was steaming. The chairs weren't even pushed back. 6 people had simply ceased to exist in the time it took to walk 20 feet. He pushed the gate. It didn't creak. It slid open with a silent, oiled precision that made the hair on his arms stand up. Someone or something was expecting him. The front door of the manor was carved from dark oak, depicting scenes of a forest so dense the figures within seemed to be suffocating. Elias knocked. The sound echoed deep within, a hollow thud that felt like it was hitting wood and bone alike. The door swung inward. "Hello?" Elias called out. No one answered, but the foyer was lit. Dozens of candles sat in silver candelabras, their flames perfectly still. There was no draft here. The air felt thick, like walking through water. He stepped onto the Persian rug, his boots sinking deep into the pile. To his left, a grand staircase spiraled upward into darkness. To his right, the dining room. He walked toward it, his heart hammering a rhythm against his ribs that felt too fast, too loud. The table was set, 6 plates, 6 sets of silver, and in the center a bowl of fruit. He leaned in, then recoiled. The fruit wasn't plastic, but it wasn't rotting either. It was mummified, shriveled grapes and blackened apples that looked 100 years old, yet they gave off no scent. "Mr. Thorne," a voice rasped. Elias spun around. Standing in the shadows of the hallway was a man so thin he looked skeletal. He wore a tuxedo that was impeccably clean but decades out of style. "I am Julian," the man said. His eyes were milky, clouded by cataracts, yet he seemed to look right through Elias. "The master is in the library. He does not like to be kept waiting." "The master? Who sent the letter?" Elias asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "The house sent the letter," Julian replied. "I merely licked the stamp." Julian led him to the second floor. The walls were lined with portraits, but as Elias walked past, he noticed something chilling. The subjects in the paintings were changing. In one, a young woman smiled. By the time Elias had passed her, her jaw had dropped open in a silent scream. He didn't stop to look closer. The library was a rotunda, floor-to-ceiling books smelling of old parchment and something metallic, like blood. In the center sat a man in a high-backed leather chair, his face turned toward a massive fireplace. "Sit," the man said. Elias sat. "You're the one who knows what happened to the Sterlings?" The man turned. He wasn't old. In fact, he looked barely 30, but his hair was snow-white. The Sterlings didn't leave Elias. They were folded. Folded? What is that supposed to mean? The man, who introduced himself as Alistair Blackwood, leaned forward. Think of time and space as a piece of paper. Most of us live on the flat surface, but sometimes the paper creases. People get caught in the fold. They are still here in the same room, but they are behind the dimension we can see. He picked up a heavy iron key from the table. You want your story? You want to know why no one ever finds the bodies in Blackwood Pines? It's because the house is the fold. It's a predator that feeds on attention. By coming here, you've fed it. Suddenly, the candles in the library flickered and died. "Julian?" Alistair called out, his voice tinged with a sudden, sharp fear. A wet, sliding sound came from the darkness behind Elias's chair. He whipped out his flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, hitting the spot where Julian had been standing. The butler was gone, but his tuxedo was there. The clothes lay on the floor, perfectly arranged as if the man inside had simply evaporated. The shoes were still tucked under the hems of the trousers. The shirt was still buttoned. Starting, Alistair whispered, "The house is hungry. We need to leave. Now." Elias grabbed Alistair's arm, but the man didn't move. "You don't understand," Alistair said, his eyes wide. "The front door is no longer the front door. The geometry has changed." They ran from the library, but the hallway they had entered through was gone. In its place was a narrow stone corridor that smelled of damp earth and salt. "Keep the light on the floor," Alistair warned. "Don't look at the corners of the ceiling." "Why?" "Because that's where the shadows pool. If you look at them, they gain shape. And once they have shape, they have hunger." Elias tried to focus on his boots, but the walls were closing in. He could hear voices, whispers that sounded like his own mother calling his name, then morphing into the sound of grinding metal. "Elias," the walls groaned. "It's not real," he muttered. "It's an auditory hallucination caused by infrasound or mold. Science won't save you here," journalist Alistair snapped. The Sterling children thought it was a game too. They played hide and seek. They hid in the shadows, and the shadows decided to keep them. They reached a door. Elias threw it open, expecting the foyer. Instead, they were in a bathroom, but the proportions were wrong. The bathtub was 20 feet long, and the ceiling was so low they had to crouch. "The house is losing its grip on the Euclidean plane," Alistair muttered. "We have to get to the cellar. It's the only place where the foundation is still anchored to the real world." As they crossed the distorted bathroom, Elias caught his reflection in a cracked mirror. He stopped dead. In the reflection, he wasn't alone. A tall, pale figure with fingers like spindly branches was standing directly behind him, its hand hovering inches from his neck. In the real room, there was nothing. "Alistair!" Elias screamed. Alistair grabbed him and hauled him toward the next door. "Don't look at it. The reflection is just a different angle of the fold. If it touches you there, you feel it here." Elias felt a cold, stinging sensation on his neck. He reached up and drew his hand away. It was covered in blood. 3 perfect, razor-thin slices marked his skin. "It's getting closer," Alistair said, his voice trembling. "The house, it's digesting us." They found the cellar door behind a tapestry that felt like human hair. As they descended the stone steps, the temperature plummeted. The air was no longer thick. It was freezing. At the bottom of the stairs, Elias's flashlight beam hit something white. He gasped. Bones. Hundreds of them. Not just human, but animals, birds, dogs, deer. They weren't scattered. They were woven together to form a sort of nest in the center of the room. "This is the truth," Alistair said, his voice sounding hollow. "The Sterlings didn't just vanish. They were the first meal. Every few decades, the house needs a witness, someone to acknowledge it, to fear it. That fear is what keeps the walls solid. You brought me here," Elias realized, backing away. "You're not a victim. You're the lure." Alistair looked down at his own hands. They were starting to turn translucent. "I was the witness 50 years ago, but I'm fading. The house needs a new anchor, a new master to sit in the library and wait for the next envelope to be sent." The shadows from the corners of the cellar began to detach themselves. They crawled across the floor like spilled ink, moving toward Elias. "If you stay," Alistair whispered, "you live. You live forever as the caretaker of the fold. If you leave, well, no one has ever left." Elias looked at the bones, then at the fading man, then at the ink-black shadows. He remembered his recorder. He pulled it out and pressed play. The sound of his own voice filled the cellar. "The truth is buried in the cellar. The truth isn't a story," Elias shouted. "The truth is that this place is a parasite." He didn't run for the stairs. He ran for the furnace in the corner of the room. It was an ancient, cast-iron beast, filled with coal dust and old newspapers. "What are you doing?" Alistair shrieked. "You'll collapse the fold. We'll all be crushed. Better crushed than eaten." Elias struck a match. The fire didn't catch like a normal fire. It roared with a blue flame, screaming as it hit the hair tapestry and the bone nest. The house began to shake. Not a physical shaking, but a vibration that made Elias's vision blur. The walls began to bleed a thick, black oil. The shadows recoiled, hissing like steam. "You fool!" Alistair vanished, his body turning into a cloud of white ash that was sucked into the chimney. Elias scrambled up the stairs. The hallway was no longer a hallway. It was a throat, the walls pulsing and wet. He ran toward where he thought the front door was. He saw a light, not a candle, but the pale moon shining through the iron gates. He dived through the front door just as the wood turned into something soft and toothy. He hit the gravel of the driveway and didn't stop. He ran until he reached his car, fumbled with the keys, and roared out of the gates. As he reached the main road, Elias looked in the rearview mirror. The hill was empty. There was no manor, no jagged tooth of a house, just a blackened patch of earth where nothing grew. He reached for his recorder to document the end of the night. He pressed play, but there was no voice, no recording of his entry, just the sound of a wet, rattling breath, and then a whisper that made him drop the device on the floor of the car. "See you in the next fold, Elias." He looked at his neck in the mirror. The 3 cuts were gone. In their place was a small, gold-rimmed tattoo of a cream-colored envelope. He was out of the house, but the house was no longer just a building. It was inside him. The miles slipped away under the tires of his car, but the silence inside the cabin felt heavier than the darkness outside. Elias drove without a destination, his hands locked onto the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Every time he glanced at the rearview mirror, he expected to see the pale figure from the manor bathroom, but there was only the empty road. He tried to turn on the radio, but all that came out was static, a rhythmic, pulsing static that sounded suspiciously like a heartbeat. He realized then that the silence of the world outside was a lie. The world wasn't silent. He had just lost the ability to hear it correctly. He stopped at a gas station 2 towns over, a bright, fluorescent oasis that should have felt safe. But as he stepped out of the car, he noticed the shadows of the gas pumps weren't pointing away from the lights. They were pointing toward him. He walked into the convenience store, his footsteps echoing on the linoleum. The clerk, a teenager with headphones around his neck, didn't look up. Elias approached the counter, his throat dry. "Can I get a coffee?" he asked. His voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. The clerk looked up, and for a second Elias saw it. The clerk's eyes were milky, just like Julian's. Then the boy blinked, and they were normal brown eyes again. "Sure thing, man," the clerk said, gesturing toward the back. Elias walked toward the coffee pot, but as he passed a row of snacks, he saw his reflection in the glass of a refrigerator. In the reflection, the store was empty. No clerk, no shelves, just a vast, gray expanse of dust. He froze. He reached out to touch the glass, and his hand didn't meet resistance. It sank into the surface like it was made of thick syrup. He yanked his hand back, gasping. He didn't wait for the coffee. He ran back to his car, ignoring the clerk's confused shout. He drove until the sun began to peek over the horizon, a bruised purple light that offered no warmth. He finally pulled over in a park, miles from any buildings. He needed to think. He needed to understand the fold. Alistair had said the house was a predator that fed on attention. Elias had given it his full attention for hours. He had documented it, recorded it, and feared it. He had become part of its narrative. He pulled his notebook from his pocket, the one where he had scribbled his initial research. He flipped through the pages, but the ink was moving. The words were rearranging themselves, crawling across the paper like ants. They didn't form sentences anymore. They formed a map of his own house, his apartment in the city. He saw the layout of his bedroom, his kitchen, his small office. And in the center of the map, in the spot where his bed should be, was a tiny, hand-drawn black door. Elias felt a surge of nausea. He realized he couldn't go home. If the house was inside him, then everywhere he went, the house followed. Every door he opened could be a door back into the manor. Every mirror could be a window for the things that lived in the creases of the world. He spent the next 3 days living out of his car, sleeping in parking lots and eating fast food. He stopped looking in mirrors. He covered the rearview mirror with a rag. He stopped recording his thoughts. He tried to starve the house of his attention. But on the 4th night, the dream started. He wasn't in a house, he was the house. He felt the weight of the roof on his shoulders, the cold stone of the cellar in his gut. He could feel the people walking through his hallways, the Sterlings, Julian, Alistair. He could feel their fear, and it tasted like honey. He woke up screaming, his car filled with the scent of mummified fruit. He looked at his hands. They were becoming pale, almost translucent in the moonlight. He knew then that he couldn't run. The fold wasn't a place you could leave. It was a state of being. He had been chosen to be the new anchor, and the fire in the cellar had only served to break the physical walls, releasing the essence of the manor into the world. He drove back toward Blackwood Pines. He didn't know why, but it felt like a magnetic pull. As he neared the valley, the car engine began to hum a melody, a low, mournful tune that he recognized from an old music box he'd seen in the manor's nursery. The gates were still there, standing tall and iron-black against the gray sky. But the hill was no longer empty. A house stood there. It wasn't the same manor. It was a modern house made of glass and steel, looking exactly like the apartment building Elias lived in back in the city. He parked the car and walked toward the door. It opened before he could touch it. Inside, the foyer was lit with electric lights, but they flickered with the same rhythm as the candles. The furniture was his sofa, his television, his books. But as he walked through the living room, he saw the dining table. It was set for 6, and in the center, a bowl of mummified fruit. "Welcome home, Master Thorne," a voice whispered. Elias didn't turn around. He knew who it was. It was himself. He walked to the library, which now looked like a high-tech media room. He sat in the ergonomic chair and turned toward the large screen on the wall. The screen showed a young woman standing at the gates, a camera in her hand. She looked nervous, excited, ready for her big break. Elias reached for a cream-colored envelope sitting on the desk. He took a gold-rimmed card and began to write. He felt the hunger grow in his chest, a cold, hollow space that only fear could fill. He licked the stamp, and as he did, his eyes turned milky and white. The fold had found its new witness, and the story was beginning all over again. He watched the woman on the screen. She was checking her equipment, talking into a small microphone. "Entry 1, she said. "I'm at the gates." Elias smiled, a slow, jagged movement of his lips. He could feel the house stretching its walls, shifting its hallways to meet her. The glass of the windows turned to teeth, and the shadows in the corners of the ceiling began to pool. He wasn't Elias Thorne anymore. He was the memory of Elias Thorne, kept alive by the very thing that had consumed him. He picked up a pen and started a new entry in a leather-bound ledger. The ink flowed perfectly, black and permanent. He wrote her name, he wrote the date, and then he wrote the word folded. Outside, the wind began to breathe again, a wet, rattling sound that echoed through the valley. The woman pushed the gate, and it slid open with a silent, oiled precision. She stepped onto the gravel, her heart hammering a rhythm that Elias could feel in the floorboards beneath his feet. He leaned back in his chair, the white hair on his head catching the glow of the screen. He was the master now, and he had a long, long time to wait. The world outside continued to spin, but here, in the crease of the paper, time had no meaning. There was only the hunger, the shadows, and the endless, shifting halls of the house that wouldn't die. As the woman entered the foyer, Elias whispered a single word into the intercom system he hadn't known was there. "Hello?" The woman called out. Her voice was full of the same hope he had once carried. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The house would do the talking for him. He watched her move toward the dining room, toward the mummified fruit and the silver plates. He watched her see her reflection in the glass, and he watched the shadow behind her begin to rise. It was a beautiful cycle, a perfect machine of terror. And as the sun went down over Blackwood Pines, the house disappeared once more, leaving only the cold, dark woods and the sound of a girl screaming in a language that no one left alive could understand. Elias closed the ledger and closed his eyes, listening to the house digest another piece of the world. It was quiet, finally, for now, but the letters were already written, stacked in a neat pile on the corner of the desk, addressed to journalists, historians, and thrill-seekers across the country. Each one held a small piece of the house, a tiny fold waiting to be opened. Elias knew that by morning, the mailman, who didn't exist in this world but appeared whenever the house needed him, would come to collect them. And the process would continue. The house would grow, room by room, victim by victim, until the entire world was nothing but a series of interconnected folds, a labyrinth with no exit. He felt a moment of pity for the girl downstairs, but it was quickly swallowed by the house's overwhelming need. He was no longer a man. He was an architect of nightmares, and business was good. He sat back, the darkness of the library wrapping around him like a shroud, and waited for the next knock on the door. It wouldn't be long. The world was full of people looking for the truth, and Blackwood Manor always had plenty to spare. The night stretched on, but the clock on the wall never moved. Its hands were frozen at the exact moment the Sterlings had vanished a century ago. Elias realized that the house didn't just consume space. It consumed time. Every person who entered became a frozen moment, a static image in the manor's long, dark memory. He could see them if he closed his eyes, the maid with her roast, the children with their toys, Julian with his silver tray. They were all still here, trapped in the milliseconds between one breath and the next. And now he was their curator. He stood up and walked to the window. He couldn't see the valley anymore. He could only see the reflection of the room, layered over and over again like a hall of mirrors. He touched the glass, and for a second he felt a spark of the old Elias, the one who wanted to tell stories, not be one. But the feeling passed, replaced by the cold, steady hum of the manor's heart. He was home, and home was a place you could never leave.